I was like, well, I seem to know pretty much everything about everything, so I could help people. You know, chat's still just blowing up, you know, and just being kind of on the ground floor of that. I'm really worried about, like, I don't want to overgrow us because, you know, I mean, history is full of just people who've overreached and that everything's kind of falling apart. I mean, as a smaller agency, you know, it's good that we can stay in the
Welcome everybody to the Lifeline series, Better Know a Director. I'm ecstatic to have with us today a very special guest at a very special venue. We are at the American Association of Suicidology Conference. It's the 50th annual conference. And I was able to track down Beau Pinkham and get him to sit down with us and talk about his work as a crisis center director. So thank you, Beau, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So I guess to start us off, it would be helpful to know a little bit about you, a little bit about your history in the crisis intervention, crisis center world, and what interests you about suicide prevention.
Yeah, so I actually started as a volunteer at our crisis center, the Crisis Center in Johnson County in Iowa. In 2002, I saw a flyer up in the dorm that I was staying in. And I was like, well, I seem to know pretty much everything about everything, so I could help people. So I went and I did their training, which wasn't quite as extensive as it is now, but it was still quite a bit. And I went ahead and did that, and then I just started volunteering. And I think if you talk to anybody who volunteers at a crisis center, it becomes really addictive just because you love it so much. And I volunteered there for about 10 years. Completed my degrees at Iowa. And I was in a weird place where I was studying business. A lot of the ways that I inform myself as a director is through my background in business management and stuff like that. But when I graduated with my business degree, I was immediately like, well, I don't actually want to work in a business because that's not really helping people. And so I stuck around the area and I worked for some nonprofits. And then eventually the Crisis Center had a coordinator position open up and I applied for that. Got it, and then recently I was moved up to director, and so that's what I've been doing ever since.
So I mean, it's interesting because I feel like we kind of share a little bit of that experience in that we came from the volunteer position first, and you're right. I mean, there's a very rewarding quality. There's an addiction level.
Yeah.
That you're really excited to go in for that overnight shift or that afternoon shift or whatever it is, and it really fosters that passion that then now you can kind of still draw from, even in a position where you're actually in a leadership position.
Yeah, and I enjoy the fact that I had such a boots on the ground look at things that that really helps me keep things in perspective when I'm just starting to think about changes to the agency, changes to my department. And I am now making sure that I can spread that kind of outlook to the supervisors and coordinators that I now manage, because I think it's really important in crisis intervention to never forget. The bottom line is you're having one human being interact with another human being, and you really have to kind of approach it from that perspective and then expand outwards like that.
Right. I mean, it definitely helps to have that background, and when you're thinking about doing anything, it lets you remember the volunteer, the staff member, the priorities. Like you want them to be comfortable with whatever administrative changes you make, and then how that affects the contacts that they're talking to. Yeah, that's really cool. So you just became director.
Yeah,
is that right?
Yeah.
How long ago?
It was January, February.
Cool.
Yeah.
Cool. So this is a relatively recent position for you, but like you said, you've been with the Crisis Center for quite a while, several years, over a decade, in one capacity or another. So in your experience there, and what you've been through at the Crisis Center, what are some successes? What are some things that really stand out as big things that happen at the Crisis Center?
We were one of the first centers to really start going gung-ho on chat, and especially volunteer-driven chat. And that was kind of a special moment for us. I was actually one of the first volunteers at our agency to get chat trained, which was really cool. And at that point, iCarol was this new magical system that we had no idea about, and I was like, oh my god, I can do this, at home in my pajamas. That's amazing. So I don't do that anymore. I wear professional garb.
Good.
But yeah, so the development of the chat program under a previous coordinator from me, and then its expansion, and then it really blew up under Rachel Beach, who some of you might recognize. She was our previous chat coordinator. She did a lot of wonderful work for us, and I was able to come in and kind of help solidify that as well. And really just being, part of, chat's still just blowing up, and just being kind of on the ground floor of that and seeing that spread nationwide and kind of seeing other, centers get excited about it as well has been, just truly remarkable for us. It's been a lot of fun. Also, just having such a robust volunteer program, I truly, truly believe in the idea that crisis intervention does not need someone with, a clinical master's degree of any kind or anything like that, or even a bachelor's degree. Some of our best volunteers have started with us since their freshman year in college. I was one of them, not to toot my own horn, but I think it just shows that, all the skills that we do in crisis intervention, however you're implementing it, are very teachable. And so long as you're doing your best to find the right people, and vetting them and training them and constantly developing them, someone as young as 18 is perfectly capable of talking someone down from suicide or just talking them through a really rough day.
So that was, we've talked a little bit about chat before, and how...
A little is underselling.
For hours.
Chris, yeah.
But yeah, so one of the things that you had mentioned was this, and you just kind of talked about this a little bit, but using the new technology and the new service provision as a leverage to bring in more volunteers with specific skill sets and different abilities when it comes to technology and what they're used to. But something that really surprised me was that you were saying that chats outnumber actual phone calls at this point.
After about 6 or 7 years.
How does that change things? Like, what are you
it's interesting, and honestly, we're just one center, so I could do as much statistical analysis as I wanted, but I don't know if it's part of national trends. We'll talk about this at the panel that we're doing tomorrow. But it's interesting because 5 years ago, when I first took my coordinator job, we had trouble filling our chat shifts. Most people preferred phones. And keep in mind back then, our chat training was separate from our phone training. It was, it was just something that if you wanted to do it, you could do it. Some people did, especially the younger people, but we didn't advertise it nearly as much, and we didn't offer it nearly as much as we did our regular training. And now 5 years later or so, we actually have more people wanting to do chat than phones.
Yeah.
And again, is that just a generational thing? It could be. I'm definitely going to say that that's probably part of it. But it's also just familiarity with the system and just with the idea that, I can do this from anywhere. I can help out the crisis center in a lot of different ways by doing this. Especially through iCarol, we can do chat and text at the same time. So that's two different media that you have interaction with. It's been, now I'm kind of unhappy that now I have to kind of figure out how do I get people on the phones, because phones aren't going to go away. Even if the populations there gradually grow older and older, it's going to be around for a good long time as well. So it's been a unique little problem, but it's a good problem to have,
right? Because
our volunteer population is still growing anyway, just because we've had much more ways of just recruiting people. Nowadays we do a heavy emphasis on chat because chat. You can take multiple chats if you're comfortable with it, so people can see to the needs of multiple clients, and so chats have an easier way of growing themselves, while phones are still pretty constrained.
It scales differently.
Yeah, it scales much differently, and then you get into the idea. We've had volunteers who've moved away. So we've had volunteers do chats for us from China, Romania, Belarus at one point, and that's just the extreme. If you have college seniors who are moving away. You can still usually get them for another year while they go on to grad school or go on to jobs, and they move to a nearby state or move across the country. But they still want to be involved, and this is important. They still want to be involved with your center.
Right.
That they're involved with you, with the Crisis Center of Johnson County. And if that's not something they want to do, I can also, thankfully, because of connections with Lifeline and whatnot, I can try to redirect them to other crisis centers that have similar standards to ours.
Yeah, I mean, and that's something that we hear, at least for the interviews that we've done so far with this series, in the crisis centers that are doing chat. That's something that we hear over and over again, is that these volunteers and staff are so dedicated and so loyal to and passionate about providing these services that even when they can't physically be there, they want to find some way to still contribute to the center that they're helping out.
Yeah.
And that's just, it really does just speak volumes about the passion and dedication of those people. The people in this field. So it's just really, really cool to continue to see that kind of pattern happening.
Yeah.
Okay, well, and so one of the other things that I was going to ask about was challenges, but I think we kind of just touched on a little bit of a very unique challenge in trying to fit the gap of providing phone coverage when you have so many people wanting to provide a different sort of coverage.
Yeah, and I think it's easy, with centers that are, centers like ours and like a lot of centers across the nation are growing, and it's easy to lose focus on kind of, your bread and butter and what got you there. The Crisis Center of Johnson County wouldn't be where it was without having a phone line for 47 years now. I mean, it's just, that's what started us in a tiny little apartment on the U of I college campus. And it's still, the numbers are still there. It's not like those numbers have drastically declined. So there's that. There's just also the idea of, what's next. How much is too much growth, and because we're starting to look at, and all the wonderful work you've been doing with, starting to look with what are we doing with Facebook? What are we doing with social media? There's so many different avenues that we could reach people in crisis and start doing crisis intervention and suicide prevention that we haven't really been tackled the top of. But can we get involved with that as a center? As this relatively small, at least physically, center in Iowa City, or is that something that if we keep doing that, will phones continue to suffer, for lack of a better word? I'm really worried about I don't want to overgrow us because I mean, history is full of just people who've overreached and then everything's kind of fallen apart. But again, also we have a dedication to our clients, is we want you to be able to reach us in as many ways as possible.
Right.
So it's that fine line, and that's something that we're just going to have to navigate in the next few years as more things blow up, text and social media. We also started a mobile crisis program 2 years ago, and that's not something that I see talked about much here at AAS and other conferences, and really in the crisis intervention field in general, usually because they're not well funded or states sometimes just refuse to fund them, which you can't really control sometimes. But mobile crisis is amazing. It's probably the best way to do crisis intervention if you can afford to do it. So we're really rapidly expanding, and part of me might have to say at some point we might just need to stabilize what we're doing.
So trying to simultaneously remain flexible on what you provide and make sure that you're on the leading edge of the things that are happening, but also not overextending. Everybody there and making sure that it's sustainable. Yeah, I
mean, as a smaller agency, it's good that we can stay nimble. Nimbleness is something that's really important. To me personally, is we need to be able to adapt and fit whatever changes. If when 2008, when the floods of the Midwest happened, we were one of the first agencies in Iowa that stepped up and started doing immediate disaster recovery response and starting coalitions in the community, and that was great. It was also, and I wasn't even on staff at that time, but I just knew it was a gigantic headache for everyone involved, because on top of that, we were manning a crisis line that was now blowing up.
Right.
We had just started looking into the idea of chats coming down the stove. How do we go about doing that? So it's tough. It's really tough. But if you don't stay nimble, there's going to be forces in play in the crisis intervention field that eventually will force you to be nimble, or you just won't adapt enough in time, and then something horrible will probably happen to your funding. Yeah. Fingers crossed it doesn't happen.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, everybody kind of experiences that on different levels. Is that it's just really unpredictable. So if you can put yourself in positions where, you know, we hear a lot of people talk about keeping a plate at the table, making sure that you're talking to people in your state, talking to people in your local area, your county, your city, but always trying to make sure that people are aware of you, and that if an opportunity does arise, that you're the first one that they think of.
Yeah.
And by doing a lot of these kinds of diverse service provisions like that, that gets your name out, and gets your face out, and gets Johnson County like in front of people. Cool. Well, so the other thing is, and we just actually kind of alluded to this a little bit, but I'm wondering how, in your experience in either the position that you're in now or previously, how have you seen collaboration with the Lifeline benefit Johnson County?
Yeah, that is a surprisingly difficult question, just because we've had our fingers in a lot of different pies nationally. But really, just the community that Lifeline has established, and just being able to be part of these conferences. When we finally got that Core Center grant, which we were over the moon with, and Rachel Beach, who I mentioned before, worked really hard on that and did a tremendous job. That kind of cemented the idea that not only have we made it, so to speak, but we also now have just all these friends and allies in these other centers who are really on board and share similar aspects to their own training, even if it's not even volunteer driven. If it's just completely employee based or whatnot. It's that community that Lifeline builds where we can rely on each other. And I'm not just talking about conference calls and stuff like that. I'm just talking about being able to powwow with people for 20 minutes that I've personally met at these conferences, and just being can we bang out just talking about this kind of change, maybe not implementing it, but just seeing how can we best make our voices heard. And the people at Lifeline, like Chris, not to toot your horn, but other people have been just immensely responsive to kind of helping us as member agencies and making sure that our voices are heard and also reflected in kind of national trends and whatnot. So that's been really important to us. I don't think we'd be where we are without just the benefit of having that support network like Lifeline provides.
We've asked this to everybody that I've interviewed so far, and I want to just kind of keep it rolling in that, can you think of, or do you know of a time when, the crisis center, the services that you guys provide, has really successfully touched somebody in the community, has saved lives? Or is there an instance that you've been told about, or that even you remember from the phones, that you don't use identifying information?
Put me on the spot to not break confidentiality.
Yeah, right.
Every service that we provide has saved lives. I'm trying to think, because I was a volunteer for 10 years. I remember a gentleman who would call in, and he had diagnosed schizophrenia, and he wasn't able to regularly get the medication for various reasons that he needed to kind of deal with it. But he knew about it enough that even when he was having psychotic issues or whatnot, he could self-diagnose, this is probably my schizophrenia acting upon it. So he would call me every weekend, because I was a weekend volunteer, which is one of the reasons they loved me, because nobody likes to volunteer on the weekends. He would call me every weekend, knew me by name, and he's like, well, these voices are starting up again, but here's what I'm going to do. And he would go through his action plan, and it was almost always the same. It involved watching a football game, taking a shower, and then taking a walk with his dog. And, that went on. He was one of my first callers when I had first started on the crisis line, and that went on for 3 years. And my calls with him, you probably could have just recorded me and then set the tape recorder up to the phone, because I didn't really say much. He had his process. And then 3 years, went by, and then I didn't hear from him for 6 months. And I was a little worried, that you take that home with you, but you also, we invest a lot in self-care, so you can't really take that personally. Who knows what happened? And he called in once, and I was still on the weekends, and he managed to get me in. He was like, hey, you know, I just want you to know I'm in a better place, and I couldn't have done this without you.
Wow.
And you personally.
Yeah.
And, you know, that was me. But the true joy of working in crisis intervention and the positions that you and I have held, I think, is hearing that exact same story from the people that you trained. There's just no, I mean, I haven't found, it's in my top 5 of feelings to have. If my fiance ever watches this, you're number 1, Sarah. But it's just, I can't begin to describe how great that feeling is. It's something that I'll cherish for the rest of my life.